MTN Zakhele became the first company to list on the empowerment segment of the JSE today, but the Nigerian troubles at the parent company MTN are far from over. That big $5.2 billion fine looming over the business. Now, Boye Gbadebo is the MDF at Ake Partners. That's a government relations corporate advisory firm which manages relationships with governments and regulators for clients across the African continent. Good evening to you, Boye. Let's talk about this MTN issue. My reading of it and the reading of the guests that we've kind of discussed in the last week has been that MTN underestimated the Nigerian regulator, was careless, and is now paying the penalty.
That's probably not far wrong, actually. I think the accusation that you can level at MTN is perhaps a misreading of the current sort of political environment. There were sort of two issues which the Buhari administration was extremely concerned about. One was security, the second was corruption. Both of those issues obviously have a significant impact on foreign investment and perception. And both of those issues could have been addressed by MTN if they had, I suppose, engaged the regulator effectively and quickly, and more importantly, had deregistered, obviously, the SIM cards. It's the lack of a resolution on that issue gave rise to particular concerns when it came to the security issue. At the same time, the regulators were, particularly like the NCC in this case, which is the Nigerian Communication Commission. They had a new regulator in August of this year. He's an academic, so he's not part of the, I suppose, the commercial business elite in Lagos.
Just a query. I mean, from what the statements I've heard from MTN and other some sources, the MTN did actually cut off these SIM cards, but did it a bit late. They didn't do it timelessly. Was that the real issue? And secondly, was that enough of an infringement to justify this kind of fine, or was it more a case of making an example? And finally, what other operators out there, did they commit similar kind of offences? Was MTN an outlier? And if the other operators didn't commit similar offences, were they fined or punished as heavily as MTN was punished?
I think the first point, the first point to raise on this is the fact that this wasn't something that just happened sort of yesterday. This goes back to since 2008. That was when the security services approached the NCC, the regulator, as well as the operators, and say, look, we have an issue here. We have a security issue. How can you help us resolve it? And in 2010, they reached an agreement that SIM cards should be registered. Now, that took, I think the regulator gave them 6 months. It wasn't really addressed until 2013. There was still quite a few, I think altogether maybe 50 million.
And they had been
SIM
given other
cards
fines. They had been fined for other issues. So, I mean, they've had a few yellow cards before this massive red card.
Absolutely. I mean, they were fined in 2013. They were fined again in August of this year. And so this isn't something that, and I think the point to raise here is the fact that it wasn't just MTN. It was all the operators were fined.
But come to Viv's point, I mean, this massive, massive fine, $5.2 billion, are other companies, have they been treated equally? And in future, can we expect similar punishment?
Yeah. I think, again, two important points. First of all, the other operators, they were fined in August, but then they did switch off subsequently unregistered SIM cards. MTN still had 5.2 million SIM cards, which they didn't.
I'm not clear on this. Is it possible, literally, to switch them off? You don't have to go through 5 million accounts. I mean, how difficult was it for them to comply? But it sounds like they had enough time.
Yeah, if you think about this, I mean, security was fundamental to the Buhari election campaign. he said he will deal with Boko Haram. And what happened is that you still had terrorists using MTN SIM cards in order to engage in their activities. And that was an issue which should have been resolved in 2010. It wasn't. It should have been resolved when they were fined in 2013, like all of them. It wasn't. It could have been resolved in August of this year when all of them were fined. It wasn't. Basically, the rules of the game in Nigeria have changed. And that is something which not only MTN, not only the other telecom operators, but virtually all foreign investors have to understand that one can't continue to adopt a very cavalier attitude to regulation, whether it be in Nigeria, Kenya, or other territories. And I think that was where MTN misread the signs. They thought it was business as usual. They were fined essentially, I think in 2013, around a few $100,000.
Well, the question, the more he talks, the more Boye talks, the worse it sounds. In terms, it's not the Nigerians' fault, it's MTN's fault. Is this a hanging offence, Viv? Should the CEO go over this? I mean, in terms of shareholder value?
I mean, in terms of shareholder value, yes. I mean, this is one of those events, if it was avoidable, it was something which you were not treated unfairly, but just basically misread the rules of the game. I mean, look at the BP disaster, a similar kind of impact on the company. The CEO came there, handled the situation, and as soon as it was effectively over on the emergency side, the triage part of it was over, he basically had to leave the company.
One thinks of Barclays as well,
exactly.
Top banking organizations where the CEO takes the rep. What's your view on that?
I think it's actually fundamental to the resolution of this issue, because how you would address this going forward is that both the quantum of the fine was sending a message that the rules have changed and that you have to comply. So obviously there's a punitive element to that. So in order to reduce the punitive element, you have to show an appropriate degree of contrition. And I think by whether it's the CEO or some other heads, there should be some resignations.
Well, just a further question. I mean, we've seen a similar kind of approach by the U.S. Justice Department with regards to, offences in the financial sector. We're talking about massive fines for companies like JP Morgan, UBS, HSBC, et cetera, et cetera. And, to a certain extent, that has kind of been ignored by, the companies. They say they make enough profits, and maybe this is not the case with MTN. But I mean, do you foresee a case where these kind of infringements go to a point where they stop being financial penalties, but starts become criminal penalties for, executives that ignore government regulations?
So they go to jail, maybe.
Yes, but it's a lot harder. It's a lot harder to send a senior executive to prison than it is to actually fine them and to actually receive the money, because the amount of money which a regulator or the prosecution authorities actually have to spend and the time is probably extremely high.
Yeah, but the question is, does fining the company, which effectively harms shareholders and may not actually harm the executives because they may actually be able to leave with golden parachutes. That's right. But the executives are actually the decision makers, the actual fundamental. I mean, you can't expect a shareholder to understand how to run the company.
I think MTN's a very good example here. MTN sort of has specialized for the past sort of 5, 10, 15 years in emerging markets. In order for them to work in emerging markets, they have adopted a pretty sort of cavalier attitude, which has then given rise to significant dividends for shareholders. Now that almost like the chickens have come home to roost, why shouldn't the shareholders take the pain, as well as perhaps some of the senior executives by losing their position? You can't really sort of take all the benefits by allowing the senior executives to sort of run roughshod over local regulations without taking the pain also. And so it works both ways.
Fascinating stuff. Thanks to Boye Gbadebo. He is MD at Arcare Partners. Presumably he'll be having more business as a result of this MTN debacle.